Beeple. I'm going to show you in this video how I took the free files that Beeple gives away off his website and how you could process these files in Cinema 4D, bring them over into Unreal Engine, and create your own renders in a similar fashion. There's a lot you can learn from these files. There's multiple ways you could bring this over. Ultimately, it's a great learning experience, and I'm also going to show you how I finished these in Resolve to try to get as close of a match as I could get, while also taking some of my own creative liberty. So we're starting out here in Cinema 4D, and I've got Beeple's files open for Sunset. So a few notes. When I open these files up beforehand, just for the sake of time, I organized these a bit more into sections of how I wanted to export this and kind of how I viewed each piece. So probably the most important part for getting this scene exported is to make sure we've got the camera and the character so that these export and import out properly. And then I also broke this down into these falling rocks sections, which you'll see breaking up at the top. And we have this atom array that you can see is out of place along with the rocks. And then the last one I broke into is these static meshes, so floor planes and all of these objects. So I'll go through each section of just what I modified based off the original files, just so you can see the difference. Not a whole lot has changed here from the character. I pretty much just lumped all these together because I want these to export out. Specifically, there's boned animations and the camera movement, which I need to go out through an FBX format. The Falling Rocks section, one thing to note is these were all just being done dynamically. And I went through on each tag, I went to the cache, and then I baked every single object one by one. It didn't take very long, and you can see the memory footprint is about 2 megs each, so they're pretty lightweight, but you want to make sure you're using the cache data. And the one way you can make sure to check that is if you scroll forwards and backwards and all this information is still there, you know that it's caching. Otherwise, you have to go back to the beginning and you have to simulate each time. So the simulation will not translate to Unreal, so we have to bake these out. The next section is this atom array. So you can see this is supposed to be down on the floor along with the rocks. And usually there's a chance that this could export out into a bunch of pieces. So I made another static mesh section that has all of these landscapes that were kind of warped and then used deformers and then cloned. I already went ahead and just merged all these together. And the way I did that was I took the parent object, I'm going to do the same for this atom array, but I middle clicked on it, so I'm selecting all of its children. And then I've pinned this here, but I'm going to connect and delete. And that's just going to merge this down to a solid object that I can then move around, and I don't have to deal with a bunch of extra pieces. And since it's not animating, it doesn't really matter for this sake. And for this video, I'm going to drop this down in here as well. So when I export this out, I'm looking at having my FBX that's going to have my character animation, my falling rocks, which I'm going to export as alembic, and I'll explain why. And then this static mesh section with this camera that I could do as an FBX, but for the sake of showing it, I'm going to do it through Cineware in this one. And the reason I'm not doing Cineware for this entire project is, first and foremost, this boned animation for the character does not translate. And the camera animation, from what I'm finding, is hit or miss on whether it actually goes. I don't use it or rely on it. A lot of times I do my camera work in Unreal, but there are times where it makes more sense to do it in Cinema. So we're going to export that out separately. But also these falling rocks. So you can see each fracture object. When these fall down and break, Cineware is going to break these out into individual objects, and there ends up being around 360 in this project. So if you need to go in and reposition or change materials or toggle visibility, which we're going to have to do, that's 360 times that you have to do it. So the way we're going to do it in this one is we're going to export this out through Alembic, and we're going to merge it all together, and I'll show you how. So to get out of Cinema 4D, we're going to start by exporting these out. So the first section, I'm going to middle click on this. You can do File, Export, and then FBX. I pinned the links up here, or the buttons up here, so that I can do this quicker. So I want to make sure I've got selection only, so we're not doing the whole project, and version 2013, so 7.3. This is important, especially for your camera information. I can't really get any of these newer versions to work consistently. A lot of times the character animation will translate, but the camera stuff just doesn't import. So 2013 seems like a safe bet. So let's export this out, drop this into FBX, call this first one character camera. So the next one is all of our cached rock data. So like I said, you could do this in FBX, but it gives you a lot of different pieces that you have to reassemble. I like using Alembic because it bakes it down to one object. And you could do a bunch of materials, but for this, really it's just one material for this whole thing. And I don't really want to move anything around, but I do want to export these out individually so that I can control the visibility. So as you can see, we'll see if he actually animates in the timeline, but as you go, he's toggling visibility on the side. So if we export all these out as one, this whole thing is going to either be visible or invisible. You won't have the control over the pieces. So if we just do all of these separately, we'll be good to go. So same thing here. I'm going to middle click on here. This is my Alembic export. We're going to do the same thing. And I'm going to do the entire timeline of 370 frames. You could do smaller sections to save on file size, but these just align so much easier when I can just do them all off of frame 0. And everything else appears to be good. So we're going to export this out, drop it into Alembic, and you can see these file sizes. I went ahead and exported all these in advance just because they take a few minutes to do all these, so I figured I'd spare you the time. So all of our Alembics have been exported out. And then the last section is we've got our camera, which is also in here. I'm doing a duplicate camera just to make sure that when I import this, the framing and the composition is going to align as accurately as I can, because it needs to align to what's been done in Cinema 4D. So we've got these ground planes, we've got our environment objects, and we've got this atom array, which we're going to move once we get in there, because I want to keep this to help align and move all of the rocks and stuff together. What I am going to do is we're going to just duplicate this lady and drop her down in here. Go back to frame 0, and I want to make sure she's going to import. So this animation is not going to import, but I do want her here so I can kind of guarantee the starting point and make this as close as possible. So if something imports in a wrong spot, especially since we're not at our world origin, everything is offset a bit, this is just going to kind of give me a little bit of insurance so I know where my starting point is. So I'm going to delete these. We're going to go up to File, Save Project for Cineware, and we're going to export this guy out. Beeple, Settings, Sun, CW for Cineware. Actually, we'll leave this as C4D. All right, so now we can jump into Unreal. So at this point, I've got my base environment set up. I've got a level with just lighting in here and a corresponding sequence to go with it. So frame these up just so you can see where I started. This will need tweaking, and I'll probably do a lot of post correction, but I try to at least just get some lighting that's close enough to get me started. So to create this, Window, Environment Light Mixer, and these all start up at the top. Everything except for volumetric clouds, I added these in. So I've got my sky atmosphere, skylight, directional light, and exponential height fog. And you can just see how these start to just give you the elements in here. So for the sun, I'll adjust intensity and everything else, but I started with just messing with the source angle. So started pretty soft, and then I just cranked this up to try to get a little bit of a harsher sun, and I'll probably blow this out in post with bloom. But the other one is the sky atmosphere. So I went in and tweaked the color for the ground albedo, and then this scattering, I cranked it up and tweaked the colors a bit just to try to get it to be more along the lines of this reddish color that, you know, goes a little bit more along with what is called for. All right, let's import some stuff. So starting out, let's go into our FBX. So we'll import this first, which looks like I put that in the wrong folder, but we'll start with our character camera. So we're going to drag and drop this guy into section 1, because that's how I organized it. So when we import this, we want to make sure skeletal mesh is checked. That's going to make sure that the bones come in along with the animation. And also having this import animations checked is going to help bring in that animation as well. And we shouldn't need anything else for this. There are times where I'm importing static meshes. For some odd reason, Cinema 4D, it's about 90 degrees rotation on the x-axis. It's a little weird with the import animation, so I'm just going to bring this as is, and we'll adjust it as we need. Alright, so we can exit out of this. Alright, so you'll see that we have our assets brought in for our characters. We have our skeletal mesh, which is where our character is going to be. So we'll start just bringing this in. We're going to zero it out. And now, wherever she's at. Okay. So she's up here ready to go. And you can see the world origin is set to here, but she's over here. And the reason that is because the way Cinema 4D exports this out is the world origin, which if I drop a new object in, is right down here. So anything, if you want it to be zeroed out or you want it to import to have that anchor point in Unreal, you got to set that to the world origin. So since this scene's offset, we're just going to deal with the offset because everything's going to align to that, and that's perfectly fine for this example. So the other thing we're going to check is just to make sure that this animation looks like it's working. And maybe. There she is. So the rotation's off by 90 degrees, and this is something that we'll have to adjust. So we could drop it into an empty actor, or we should be able to tweak that on the import settings. So the import transformation, we're going to set this to 90 degrees, and we're going to re-import the animation. Now this should be more accurate. Alright, looks like she's running the right direction. So now this should align once we get in here and play this. So we'll save this out. Alright, so the next thing we're going to want to do is save all. So if Unreal crashes, it doesn't get deleted. So back out to our main folder. Next, we're going to import the Cineware. So to do that, we're going to do this drop down, and we're going to have Datasmith. Now, if you don't have this, you need to make sure that this is enabled. And the same way we import the alembic as well. So you're going to go to Settings, Plugins, and you want to type in C4D and make sure that this Datasmith C4D importer is checked. And the other one, if you type in alembic, you want to make sure that you've got your alembic importer, and then I do the geometry cache as well. And it's going to tell you got to restart the engine if you have to enable these. No big deal. Okay, so we're going to do this drop down. We're going to do Datasmith and File Import. Now I dropped this in the FBX because I wasn't paying attention. But we'll do this Beeple Setting Sun C4D Cineware. So we open this up. It's going to ask where we want it. I'm going to drop this down into Models, Beeple Sunset, and it's going to make its own folder. So that one's going to be great. And we want to make sure that we're importing everything. You can turn some of these off, especially if you're re-importing the file and you don't want to update certain things, but we're just going to do this. All right, so it looks like this imported correctly. So I'm going to quickly adjust our scene and get this set up a little bit more so we can see better. Alright, so this lady's in here. So this is, you can see what Cineware imported. So our character's in, but as you can see, none of the animation is here. But their origin and everything looks like it lines up. So That's great. So what we're going to do for now is we could delete this, but instead, the rendering, I'm going to go down to visible. We're just going to make that invisible. So it's there if we need it. And now we should be able to check and see how we're doing. So it appears that, let's see, we've got our Gorilla Cam. So this imported with our FBX, that's good. I'm gonna drag this into sequencer so it's here. We'll set this as the active camera. So now this is here, but as you can see, nothing is animating because we don't have any animations in here. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're gonna bring in our skeletal mesh. Oh, I hit the wrong one. Did that a little backwards. So if I search visible here, we're just going to make this one invisible and then toggle this one back and bring back the correct character. So the one that we want is our skeletal mesh. We're going to drag and drop this into sequencer. Now we should be able to add the animation and she should take off running. And it looks like she did, but where is she running to? So I can see for the time being, we're going to just switch this to unlit. And we're going to find where she went. So she's here and she's running. So it looks like the animation imported correctly. However, the position changes with the animation. And a lot of times this is just due to it being offset. And it's bringing this back to the world origin. Usually when I set this up, I try to bring it in pieces. But since we're kind of doing a pre-built project that's offset a bit, some of these things you have to work around. So if we go back to the beginning, what I'm going to do is, because a lot of this transformation data is, well, I guess it's not baked in. We should be able to just move her up and put her into place. Turn her around so she's going the right way. Turn these back on so I've got my reference point. Okay, so that's where this needs to align to. So I'm going to switch to my orthographic view. And these should line up pretty much 1-to-1 by the time they're done. So we'll just get them. Turn off our snaps and just get these close enough. Switch my view again. Go back to our view. All right. That's looking good. Now let's make sure she's taking off, running into the right direction. Good. That's aligning the way that we want. So now we can go back and turn all of these off again. So now, there she goes. But the camera's not going. Why is that? So the FBX we imported has the camera information in it, but because we're bringing this in as a skeletal mesh, it actually doesn't bring in the camera. So the way to fix this and to add the animation to it is the camera that we've added down here. So you could add a new camera. We're using the one that was imported into this project with the Cineware. We're going to come down here into sequencer. We're going to right click and we're going to go up to import. And this is where you go to your FBX where we've got our character camera information. And we click on this and import it. This should import our camera settings. So when we import this stuff in, match name only I unchecked because if you've renamed your camera anything else, it's going to look for that specific camera. And since there's only one in there, we just want to import this one. Force front axis X, turn that off and then create cameras. I don't want to create a new one. So these are the settings that I have and I hit import. And this is where having the 2013 version of the FBX works because any newer versions, these keyframes did not come in. So now it's calculating a bit. But if we switch to our camera view, and we might need to rotate this, we do. So you can see here what the camera movement's doing. It's offset to the side and it's rotated 90 degrees. And some of this is just how Cinema 4D exports out the camera animation. So it's dropping down. The way we can fix this is I've added in this empty actor called cam cart. I've got this drop down into the original position like we added it there too. But what we're going to do is take this camera, make it a child of this object. So that hasn't changed at all. It's still in the same spot. But now if we zero out the position and we take this null to the world origin and we rotate this by 90 degrees, we're basically offsetting what the Cinema 4D import has done. So because we're not starting the camera at the world origin, it's already like offset off into the world space, and we're rotating. By doing this, now the camera is locked back into the position that it needs to be. So to double check, exit out of this, we'll go back to lit mode. So now we've got our shaky cam that's moving into space along with our character. So the last item before we move on is to import. We've got this atom array, which I want to just drop down to the floor. Could have done this in Cinema 4D, but sometimes if there is animation information or stuff like that, it can get a little weird when you import it. So this is getting to be much closer. And the only other thing now we need to do is import in our alembic files. So I'm going to do file and save all so we don't lose any progress. And the last thing we want to do is import in our falling rock information. So what I'm going to do is go up to our alembics. We're going to start with the first one and make sure that this imports correctly, and then we'll do the rest of these. So import type, static mesh. We want to set this to geometry cache because we want all this point level animation that it's storing. And 370 frames is exactly what we want. Flatten tracks, I'm going to leave this checked because this is going to strip out any material information, and since these are all just one material, I want to just replace it all together. I don't want to have to do this a number of times if it makes a bunch of materials. And then we import. So we have our fracture object has been imported. So this should work. If I drag and drop this in here, we're going to zero this out into space. Pop out of this camera view and let's look for it and see where it's at. So it's at the world origin, and it looks like the rotation is probably off, and we'll see about the position. But I'm going to drag and drop this fracture down into here. I'm going to clean this up a bit. Fractures. Drop it into there. And what I want to do is, since we imported as a geometry cache, we're going to extract that out. So this should go the entire 370 frames. Let's just set the project to. And now you can see that this guy breaks. So it looks like it's dropping the right way. It just imports down in the middle of nowhere. Because these are sitting way up into space, that's how they're spawning. So at the world origin, it's actually picking them up from the top. So we're just going to manually move these up and into position. That doesn't seem right. Rotation, that's the problem. Okay, so we've rotated these, and now they're falling down and they're hitting, but they're hitting exactly where they were in the file. So with this, now we have the world origin is here. So now actually, because our world origin set low, we've got to drop this guy down. So I think I ended up being 403. That seemed like that was right. And that looks like it's falling into place. So we're going to go ahead and import the rest of these and duplicate this a few more times. So I'm going to select all, drag all of these into here. And the import rotation, I'm just going to set these now to 90 in here, so I don't have to do it one by one in the scene, and we should be able to just drag and drop these in and then offset them down. Alright, so we've gone through this process. We've now imported everything. Yahoo! And we're going to import the rest of these in and see how they go. So I'm going to drag all these guys into the scene, drop them in. We're going to zero them all out. And now it appears that setting that rotation, hopefully everything worked out the way we wanted to. So we'll drop these all into here. We're going to set the geometry cache. Whoops, we'll undo and go back to the start frame and then do it. So we don't have to move those. And now, perfect. These all drop when they're supposed to. So now this actually aligns with the Cinema 4D file as we initially had it. So, like with the other ones, we're going to take all of these and drop them down to -403. And now these all should align exactly where they are. So the only thing we need to do now is just go through and toggle the visibility of each one. And to do that, go back to the beginning. We're going to select all of these. I'm going to go to track, actor, hidden in game. So we want these to appear at a set point. So I'm going to go to, we'll start at just 90 for argument's sake, and we're going to keyframe each one of these. Just going to give myself a bit more working room. Set the visibility, and then I'm going to go back to the start, and we're going to just uncheck all of these. So they're all off to start, with the exception of the first one, which falls and breaks. And now we just need to go through and manually set these to when they need to appear. All right. Test this out and see how it's looking. So far, this is looking like it's getting pretty close to the file. So the next thing we need to make is materials. So I'm going to just this folder, because it's a shared project, I'm just going to make some materials into here for now. So make a new folder. Make some materials, and I'm going to start by just making a basic master material. I'm going to break this down into some instances. So we'll call this underscore Beeple. And I'm going to make this pretty straightforward. I'm not going to use any texture maps at this point. I'll go back and check the reference video and maybe make a different one if need be. But for now, I'm going to hold V for our vector3 parameter, and we're just going to do base color, plug this in. I'm going to hold down S and click, so I'm going to make my scalar parameters. Specular, roughness. Doesn't look like we're dealing with anything with metallic or emissive. So for now, this will work. And then I like to set these under grouping, so we'll call it material. It's not really PBR. So now when I apply this and save it, this is just going to give me some controls so I can quickly duplicate this without having to recompile it every time. So I'm going to create a material instance. Call it material instance so we can keep it underscore or keep it sorted. Beeple 1. So the first one I'm going to do is drop this onto the floor, and we'll make as many of these as need be, But now I can come in here and I can start kind of playing with what this looks like. So roughness, increase this a bit. Specular, set this to 1. So we're actually getting our reflections. And now we can kind of just control how rough or smooth we want this. Probably going to need some roughness maps in here to break this up a bit, but we'll come back to that. And base color is fine. So for now, drop that in, and I'm just going to start putting this on everything just to see where we're at. Add this to our alembic file. Since all these are hidden, got this selected, I'm just going to apply this to everything. And now this is getting to be a bit closer, so I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to call this underscore blackout. And this I'm going to apply to our character. Let this compile. So in the video, that doesn't look like there's any lighting actually showing up on this character. So I'm going to make one of these, and I'm going to drop the specular down to 0. Make sure there's nothing reflecting, and this is completely black. So there's other and probably better ways you could do this, but for the sake, this works for me. And now we're actually getting a bit closer to the finished product of this. So everything else that's in here, I'm going to go through and apply this same material, and I will probably spend some time going through and just doing the look development and tweaking all of this stuff. But for now, we're going to apply this to everything. So at this point, really just trying to look at reference and get a good idea of where I'm still lacking. So I took a number of roughness maps that I currently had in my library. I brought those into Photoshop and then processed them into normal maps. From here, I just needed to make a new material that accounts for these different maps to try to pretty much adjust the floor and tweak it and work with it from here. Modifying the current material that I have, I'm bringing in some different UV coordinates, bringing in the normal maps, applying a flat and normal, and creating my own scalar values so that I could make this custom material. And then I can kind of look development, or I can adjust the look of this as I'm going. So from here, I could play with the UV tiling, play with the normal, play with the roughness values, but really just adjust the look of this to get something that's close enough. And since these textures were not actually included with the files, there was a few things that were missing, I had to make my own adjustments and tweak it from here. So I figured, why not take my own creative liberty? I'm remaking this. It's good enough for me. So as you can see, I'm tweaking the floor, I've adjusted the sun, I've got this in here. I do a lot of waffling back and forth. And then eventually, I say, screw it. Good enough. At least for this tutorial. The one thing I was trying to get a read on here was how much actual GI is being used. Now I know he used Octane, which is unbiased, so I'm trying to understand in between. I'm using Lumen for reflections and the global illumination. I didn't bother with ray tracing on this. I have to kind of adjust get it close enough. I know I'm going to be editing this in Resolve. I can tell from looking at it, he's done some post work between animated chromatic aberration, particle effects, other stuff. Like, he definitely took it into post, and I don't have that with me. So we're going to kind of get it close enough and put my own spin on it as we go. So one thing in Unreal that I normally don't do is using their built-in vignette and the bloom often. And sometimes if I use the bloom, it's a very small amount. And I'm usually adding additional bloom in post and resolve because I have more control over it and I like the way that it processes the bloom better. But for this one, I used small amounts. I used small amounts of it and then added to it in post, but I tried to get it as close as possible in the viewport so there's less work that I had to do after the fact. And I think one of the hardest things that I had to deal with was trying to recreate the floor material and trying to get that light reflection around the silhouette of the character as close as possible. I eventually added my own min and max roughness values to try to clamp the textures that I have and really try to get this just dialed in as close as I possibly could, knowing that I'd push this a bit further in post to try to match what I could. And by the end here, I got to a point where I said, good enough. Let's move forward. All right, at this point, I've got this thing pushed to about as far as I want to in Unreal. Everything's looking like it's pretty good, so I'm going to send this out to the movie render queue and we'll pick it up in Resolve. So open the movie render queue, and I've got a number of things set up in this project already. There's a few tutorials out there that cover color spaces and aces and tone mapper and all that fun stuff, which I'm not going to get into today, but I can post a link below if you're interested in that. So I have my scene. Save all. Bring this section down to here and open this up. So these are the default settings you have. I've already gone and pre-made and saved my config file that I'm using. So I'm using movie render queue config aces 4K. So we're going to overwrite this. So as you can see in here, I've got my directory output, my naming structure. I'm rendering this out at 4K. My console variables, there's a number of ways you can do it. Some people don't use hardly any of these and just use screen percentage. I've got a number of these and I'm disabling a lot of the effects that Unreal has in here. It slows it down a bit, but it should make a cleaner render. And I'm actually going to be rendering this out at 6K, but it's going to compress it down to 4K, so it should be nice and clean. Color output mode, I'm setting this to use Aces CG, and I'm importing it into Resolve. You could turn this off and just disable the tone curve to be in a linear workflow, but I'm going to do it this way because I've already got it set up. If you don't want to deal with that, I recommend turn this off and just use your tone curve, and you can set that in your post editor. Anti-aliasing, we're overriding it. We're not using any, and I'm using 16 temporal samples. That should be good on motion blur and should be plenty. We're using the deferred render, and then I'm rendering this out to EXRs. So I'm just going to update my output folder. For the last section of this, push the renders out of the movie render queue. I've got my EXR frames getting the folder structure set up, getting this set to where I want it to go, and we're going to just let this render. Overall, I think it took about 45 minutes to render. Not too bad. So I brought this into Resolve. I'm using the ASYS workflow, which I sent out of Unreal. Process this over, and really it's just a matter of adding the post effects and pushing this to where I want it to be. So the first things that I always do with this is I set up 2 nodes, one for tone, one for color, and then I start adding the post effects on and massaging this thing into place. So I played around with using halation. Every once in a while this gives me a decent effect, but more times than not I either dial it way back or I turn it off. And I could also see too on the left that he has these volumetric light shafts that he's using. So I'm using light rays, trying to recreate these as best as I can. From what I can tell, he probably did these in After Effects. I could be wrong on that, but I did what I could to actually recreate these in Resolve. And as you'll see through here, I go back and forth, kind of adjusting the position, the length of them, the blending, and so on and so forth. I also played around with a lens flare, and I ended up turning almost everything off other than just the very base layer that they have, just to kind of provide a little bit of lift to the shadows without having to do that in the color tone. I also noticed that he's using chromatic aberration, and it seems to animate back and forth. So I did what I could to try to animate the edges of this shifting back and forth. And finally, I went through and added a bit more vignetting to try to darken the edges as I could see in there. And that's really about it. Thanks for watching. I hope you found it helpful me chopping up other people's work and doing something different with it. If you did, show some love.